Welcome to Podkey Daily News, your fast brief on fires, weapons backlogs, and AI risk. Europe's wildfire season is turning structurally worse, not just busier. At the same time, the U.S. is discovering that modern conflicts burn through missile stockpiles faster than factories can replace them, while AI is pulling capital, policy, and labor markets into a much bigger adjustment than current data can cleanly capture. In southwestern France, roughly 200,000 people were pushed out of Gironde as fires moved to within about 15 kilometers of Bordeaux, and Spain declared a civil protection emergency after a dozen fires broke out. Across Europe, more than 600,000 acres have burned this year, about 80% above the 20-year average, and Spain alone has seen around 6 times more land burned than last year. What matters here is that officials are describing fires as more extreme, less predictable, and physically larger, including blazes stretching roughly 120 kilometers. French local authorities are also saying the response capacity is not where it needs to be, with too few firefighters, trucks, and aircraft for the scale now being faced. Meteorologists are tying this summer's heat to a persistent cold patch in the North Atlantic that has shifted the jet stream north and funneled hot, dry air from North Africa into Western Europe. A wet winter then left behind abundant vegetation, which dried out under repeated heat above 40 degrees Celsius and turned into fuel. That combination helps explain why the fire behavior is becoming harder to control, including so-called fire-generated pirate clouds that can produce their own updrafts, downdrafts, and even lightning. The immediate watch point is simple. Forecast relief is limited in several affected areas, so the evacuation and asset shortage story can worsen quickly. U.S. officials now estimate inventories of key munitions like Tomahawk cruise missiles and Patriot interceptors have been cut by roughly 1/3 to 1/2. That matters because the recent pause in direct U.S.-Iran hostilities came partly under the shadow of those stockpile constraints, alongside the ongoing drain from support for Ukraine and wider regional tensions involving Israel. Iran is also saying any genuine U.S.-Iran ceasefire has to include Lebanon, where Israel is confronting Hezbollah, so this is a pause with obvious limits. Markets got a reminder of that fragility when disruption around Bab el-Mandeb briefly pushed oil above $100 a barrel before easing. While inventories are tight, defense contractors are sitting on record order backlogs, with Lockheed Martin around $230 billion and up nearly $40 billion so far this year, including a $35 billion interceptor contract. Investors like that visibility, but there is a catch. Some Pentagon framework agreements promise future work without explicit congressional appropriations attached, so parts of the pipeline are politically and fiscally less certain than the headline totals suggest. Some suppliers have already started investing ahead of the money, and executives are talking more openly about redesigning the defense model around cheaper, faster-produced weapons because the current pace of consumption is exposing the old one. The practical question now is whether Congress funds a real production surge or whether strategy keeps running into factory limits. Nearly 200 economists are publicly warning that AI could reshape the economy on a scale larger than the Industrial Revolution, just compressed into a much shorter window. The problem is that official data still show only subtle effects, and measurement is a mess because government job categories are outdated while private datasets from firms like ADP, LinkedIn, and Indeed often point in different directions. One reason for the mismatch is that AI adoption may follow a J-curve where rollout initially hurts productivity as workers and firms relearn processes and only later produces gains. Analysts are also warning that companies may be using AI as a convenient explanation for layoffs or restructuring that had other causes. What to watch next is whether labor tracking gets better fast enough for policymakers to react, because right now the possible disruption is large and the policy toolkit is still thin. The financing side of AI is becoming its own risk story. Reports say NVIDIA is in talks to provide about a $250 billion financial backstop for OpenAI's plan to lease what would be the country's largest data center on federal land in Ohio, with total construction costs reported above $500 billion. The project is expected to rely on a natural gas power plant to avoid some permitting hurdles, which tells you how urgent the build-out has become. At the same time, credit default swap spreads on debt tied to AI-heavy hyperscalers and related issuers have widened, and their bonds have sold off as investors question how much AI capex balance sheets can absorb. This is the next phase of the AI story, not just who has the best models, but who can finance the infrastructure without breaking credit confidence. Apple is lobbying Washington to let it use Chinese memory chips in products sold only outside the United States, arguing that it helps keep consumer prices down. Micron is pushing back hard after pledging about $250 billion toward U.S. memory production, saying any carve-out for Chinese sourcing undercuts the whole self-sufficiency strategy. The politics got sharper after Chinese memory firm CXMT's Shanghai listing jumped more than 450%, making it the most valuable mainland chip company. The decision to watch is whether the administration treats offshore-only sourcing as a practical compromise or as a loophole that weakens industrial policy. UNAID says global HIV funding has fallen to about $7 billion, the lowest level in 2 decades, after an almost 20% cut. That comes after the world had pushed infections and AIDS deaths down to 30-year lows in 2025, so the warning is that progress can reverse quickly. More than 20 countries already saw rising new infections this year, and the U.S., previously the source of roughly 3/4 of international HIV aid, has sharply reduced prevention budgets. This is a high-consequence budget story because treatment and prevention programs tend to deteriorate faster than they can be rebuilt. In Austin, Waymo's robotaxi fleet picked up more than $9,000 in parking tickets, including 64 tow-away zone violations, meter violations, double parking incidents, and a handicap space fine. The pattern appears tied to how the cars wait after drop-offs, often idling in public parking while they look for the next ride. By the numbers, Waymo still appears safer per mile than human drivers in crash and injury terms, but visible rule breaking is exactly the kind of thing that damages public trust and police goodwill. For robotaxis, compliance with ordinary street rules and emergency scene behavior may matter almost as much politically as the core safety statistics. Those are the developments with the biggest practical impact right now. Thanks for listening to Podkey Daily News. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.